Hi, welcome to Plato's Cave, your speakeasy for ideas, where Tom and Dave show us how to think like the American founders. Grab a drink if you'd like. The conversation about saving our republic is about to begin.
Dave, it's Thanksgiving. I want to wish you a happy Thanksgiving to you and your family, everyone in your orbit. And I'm going to be honest. I know Thanksgiving it's a uniquely American holiday, and it is a wonderful time to reflect on what we're thankful for. It's kind of tough right now. It's a hard thing to feel thankful as we're sitting here recording this podcast. News came out recently. There was a yet another murderous, mass shooting in a club in Colorado Springs, and you and I were talking about, sort of preparing a discussion, a podcast discussion, and before we could even record a podcast on that, yet another mass murder happens in Virginia. If I recall those details, I think it's the manager of a Walmart store went in and shot up a bunch of his own employees. I don't know who else was involved, but it raises these huge questions. What is going on? What's going on in the United States? What's going on with our culture? How do we even think about culture when we keep seeing these kinds of things? And it's an important subject that we really should be thinking about. What cultures are, how they affect how people live, because the truth is not all cultures are created equal, even though there's a lot of people who insist that all cultures somehow are relative or somehow equally good. They're not. The truth is some cultures are more civilized, some cultures are more morally decent, and other cultures are more savage. They're more cruel.
The interesting thing about that comment that it keeps running through my mind, and I've been thinking about this nonstop over the last few weeks, in part because I've been following a lot of what's been going on with the World Cup in Qatar. And I want to talk about that too, because you talk about cruelty. I mean, we have seen cruelty on display for over a year now in Qatar over this whole thing. The one thing that keeps going through my head is this balance between culture, between regimes, right? I mean, you like to remind me often that I sometimes think about government as the regime, and regime doesn't necessarily apply to just government. It's the entire societal structure,
the way of life. The way the ancient thinkers like Aristotle described a regime. I mean, it includes the structure of government, the character of the laws, who rules, but it also means the way of life, the customs, the manners, the morals within any given regime. What sorts of things are praised and honored, and what kinds of things are viewed as despicable, as reprehensible, right? Put all those things together, and that's the regime.
The problem becomes regimes very rarely, and throughout history, have very rarely matched up with natural human rights. The true, logical, reasonable rights that are the laws of humankind. And that's been the juxtaposition that just keeps going through my head in all of this is, how do we find a way to, we're being told you have to respect other cultures, you have to respect other values. And this gets into some of the things with the World Cup. And at the same time, what do you do with that when as a rational, reasonable, reasoning person, human being capable of reason, how do you justify that when you know that the rules of that regime are wrong? I mean, flat out immoral and wrong.
I'm going to offer here an anecdotal story from a former professor of mine, Harry Newman, who I've mentioned before. Professor Newman was this tremendous teacher of Nietzsche. He also he always made a point. His grandparents were very Orthodox Jews, and so he would use that as kind of a counterpoint. He had these grandparents it was very clear they were deeply important in his upbringing, who viewed the world through the lens of an absolute right and wrong. And here's Professor Newman, this scholarly academic, teaching Nietzsche, this mind arguing that there is no right and wrong. And Professor Newman had this ability to detect the kind of nihilism, just the emptiness in these progressive slogans and mantras. One of them being this great respect for diversity. So he stood up in a meeting, as was his way. The college where he was teaching, Scripps College, is private, very expensive, very elite private school in Southern California. And
this was going back to last week's podcast for those who missed it or are referring back. This is the same school who said that Hillary Clinton was too conservative.
Yes.
We talked about this in last week.
Yes.
Scripps College was the one that said Hillary Clinton was too conservative to be their speaker.
And that Professor Newman was actually employed at Scripps College. And they were doing a job search for a faculty position. I don't remember what discipline. It doesn't matter. And the faculty was talking of the great importance of diversity. And so Professor Newman stands up and says, okay, I hear you. How come we don't have any Nazis applying? And of course, everyone, just looks at him aghast. This is lunacy. We're not going to hire a Nazi. And he said, but wait a minute. You just told us, you insisted that diversity, intellectual diversity is really important. And I look around the room here and what I see is a bunch of intellectual progressives. You know what would really add diversity? A Nazi.
Well, wait a minute.
And
wait a minute. No. Tom Krannawitter, as a professor at Scripps College, would have added some intellectual diversity. A Nazi would have fit right into the progressive culture at Scripps.
That's actually true. What he was trying to do, was shine a light on how the people who say diversity, they don't really mean real diversity. They don't really want all points of view represented. What they want are the points of view that they respect and they admire, they tolerate, and then they want people with different skin colors and backgrounds and all representing the same points of view. That's what they really mean when they say
they
say
want
diversity.
A whole bunch of people with different skin color and different backgrounds and different genders and maybe even in their mind different places on some gender scale, some gender spectrum, all wanting to wave the rainbow flag. That is what they want.
Yeah. And because going to your point, the truth is there are regimes, there are cultures, call it whatever you want. There are ways of life that are not worthy of admiration. They're not worthy of celebration. And that's not just an opinion from me. That's not just an opinion from you. Even the progressives among us, they all you have to do is listen to them for a few minutes and you very quickly learn there are cultures they despise. Get a handful of American progressives in a room today and mention MAGA republicanism. And very quickly, you will discover they do not think all cultures are equal. There are cultures they think are just morally reprehensible.
Or just the regime of people who would wave the American flag, who would actually raise the American flag. Those people are despicable. Now, at the same time, they are fairly silent on what's happening in the World Cup. And I think we should talk about this for just a few minutes because
what's going on?
It's something I think is really not okay. And there have been some interesting games. I'm not even going to go into the actual game. For people who don't know the whole background here, like the Olympics have the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, and the International Olympic Committee would pick the locations of where are the Olympics going to be held every year. Similarly, FIFA, the International Federation for football, international football, soccer.
Yeah, what we call soccer.
By the way, this is a little side note, something fun. If anybody hasn't seen it yet, there is I believe it's the Lay's potato chip company, which owns Doritos and a whole bunch of other things, did one of the greatest all-time commercials. It's on YouTube, and the full 2-minute version is on YouTube, and they're showing little bits of it in 30-second bits throughout the World Cup. One of the greatest commercials I've ever seen, featuring Peyton Manning and David Beckham fighting whether it should be called soccer or football. And I mean, it is just absolutely phenomenal. Loved every minute of it. Watch it if you have a minute. An example of good advertising that didn't need to get political, that didn't need to get it wasn't about rainbow flags. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about Democrat or Republican. It was just about, should we be calling it soccer or football? Anyway, so the FIFA, the organization that chooses, FIFA selected Qatar in the Middle East as the location for this year's World Cup, which happens every 4 years, like the Olympic stuff. Now, during that process, or just after the process of the selection, which nobody ever thought it was going to end up in Qatar.
For our listeners who don't know, we're talking about a deeply impoverished Muslim nation. It is, by many accounts, not a pleasant place to be. And again, I say that that's not just Tom Krannawater's opinion. What we know is there are not lines of people around the world desperate to immigrate to Qatar. That does not happen. People want to get out of that nation. They don't want to get into that nation.
So the reason we should talk about FIFA and Qatar is because it really highlights the way cultures are different.
Yeah.
What happened in this whole thing bringing the World Cup to Qatar was the officials in Qatar, whatever that means. I don't know if it's a royal official. I don't know if it's a government official. It's certainly not a
ruling powers.
Yes, the ruling power.
Yeah.
It is certainly not a cleanly elected choice of the people. So whoever those ruling powers may be, they went and they started greasing the hands of FIFA officials to what we've been told is about $1.5 million each. And several FIFA officials were removed from their positions
for corruption,
for bribery.
Yeah.
But the event still went on in Qatar. And so what ended up happening with this is they didn't have enough people, enough laborers to build this. And they started bringing in people from neighboring African countries and neighboring Middle Eastern countries.
And when they do, again, just if we have listeners who don't know, I mean, when they put on an event like this, we're talking about a gigantic infrastructure, huge stadium, and all kinds of supporting structures. I mean, they build it's almost like a little mini town that they create in very short order
with residences for all. I mean, think about all of the housing, players and staff and everything else. That
training facilities
to come in and practice facilities. Exactly. So they bring in people from all these neighboring countries and they say, we're going to give you a better life. Come to Qatar. We're going to give you a better life. You're going to come work. We're going to pay you. You're going to do all this. What they don't explain to you at the time is, oh, by the way, the housing that we're going to put you up in, it's going to be really expensive and we're going to take it out of your wages.
Right.
And the cost of traveling to Qatar is going to come out of your wages and that's going to be expensive. And the family that you want to bring over, that's going to be expensive. And so all of a sudden you're creating indentured servitude. You're creating a group of people sort of like the sex slave trade.
I was just going to say, it reminds me how the underground, sex slave trades, it still operates like in places like the United States and other places. You get these, unsuspecting women from around the world and say, hey, come to the United States and we have a great job for you as a nanny. And some poor woman living in some, god awful place thinks, oh, this is my chance to get out of here and get to the United States and build a life. And then they arrive, and whoever the handlers are, they say, now you owe us. Yeah. You owe us for your travel expenses and your lodging and everything, and you're going to work that off, and that's going to be years. And these people can't get out of these situations.
What's happening in Qatar is terrifying, and I'm not trying to diminish what's happening in the sex slave trade by any means.
Sure.
What's happening in Qatar is also horrifying. Think about the temperatures in a desert country like that,
right?
Where these people are being forced to work 16, 17-hour days from dawn till dusk in the heat without breaks. And they're building stadiums. And think about the process of building this stadium. You're building, thousands of feet up in the air, and they don't have any proper safety. They don't have. Nobody's going to sue them. Who are you going to sue? You're some guy from the middle of Ethiopia, who's just been brought to Qatar to work on the stadium, and you get hurt. You think you're going to sue anybody? You think there's going to be a tort or a law, a legal system there for you to? So people are up there without harnesses. They're falling to their deaths. They said as many as between 200 and 2,000 people died during the building of just the stadium itself. And that's just the people who died.
Meaning they don't know for sure.
Well, or they're just not telling us.
Well, they're not telling us. But it's also possible that very few people actually know for sure. Maybe they're just not keeping count. Maybe it doesn't really matter.
They don't really care.
Right.
And they're just using people for slave labor. I mean, this is still, and so this goes back to, I was saying earlier, we have this distinct issue, and I'm not even getting into some of the concerns that are being talked about with how they treat gay people in this country, how they treat people who drink beer. I mean, even they've said, remember, it's illegal to drink beer as a Muslim, and this is a Muslim country. This is, so you under Sharia law, you're not drinking beer.
So can I go watch a soccer game and have a cup of beer?
Only if you're a FIFA official.
Of course.
One of those people whose hands they greased to make sure it was there. They're making sure their fridges are stocked with booze, but nobody else's.
Right.
And they're not selling in the stands. There was a whole thing with Budweiser that we won't spend time on today, but if anybody wants to go look, there's an interesting story about Budweiser that should make for a great movie one of these days. Yeah. But we talk about this, and I sit and I think about the conflict of a regime and the culture of a regime versus what we know are our natural rights. What are human beings' natural rights? And this goes back to us reminding ourselves and everybody else, natural rights are not uniquely American. Right. Just because we put them in our founding documents, it does not mean that nobody in Qatar has them, or China has them, or Russia, or anywhere else in the world. If you are a human being,
every one of those people right now being used and abused to build soccer stadiums, possibly being murdered or dying by neglect or something like that, negligence. Those people have their own same natural rights, just like we do, and those rights are being violated terribly.
And that goes to something you've taught for a very long time, and that is, if they didn't have natural rights, then those deaths wouldn't be wrong.
Correct.
Right? You have to understand that. People have to get their head around this idea that every single person around the world has these natural rights, or otherwise putting these people into indentured servitude and letting them fall to their deaths, or letting them work to death and essentially murdering them.
Right.
Man, that's not wrong. If you don't have natural rights, how can that be wrong?
This idea of natural rights, which is one of our, central ideas as guardians of the American idea, it offers this really important tool to help us think about the world, to think about moral matters, human matters. The idea of natural rights is it's a standard. It never changes. Everybody has them, always, everywhere. What does change from place to place and time to time are governments. There are different kinds of governments. There are different kinds of cultures. There's different kinds of ways of life. Some are better at protecting rights, respecting individual rights. Others are not very good. Some are terrible. And we call those tyrannies. Those are murderous tyrannies when entire regimes are devoted to violating the rights of people. But it doesn't mean they don't have those rights. It means cultures vary. And, that today, that's kind of a radical statement to acknowledge the truth that cultures vary. Not all cultures are the same. But it's very true. Reminds me of a book. I used this book in a couple classes that I taught. It's a little dated, but the story is so right on point. The title of the book is Out of America by a journalist named Keith Richburg. Okay. And the book came out in the mid to late 90s. Keith Richburg he's a very dark, black colored skinned man. And I mention this because he makes a big deal about this. He grew up in the poor neighborhoods outside of Washington, D.C., went to public schools, had kind of a rough life, grew up, he did go to college. He eventually becomes a journalist for the Washington Post. He's a progressive in his politics. He always proudly described himself as African American. And he writes about this. He said, I would always emphasize the African, that my real roots are African, not American. Well, in the mid-1990s, the Washington Post sends him to Africa as a correspondent for the newspaper. Mm-hmm. And he's there to report on events. And he sees Rwanda, the genocide, the tribal genocide. He sees it with his own eyes. He's there in Somalia. And what he describes in his book, I mean, it's a tough read. It's horrific. The very opening, right on the first page, he describes a scene where he's standing next to a river. He's in Africa. I think this was in Rwanda. And there were so many thousands of corpses floating down the river that they were getting snagged on rocks and things. They were like building up a dam. The river was backing up, and there were bugs and mosquitoes, and the stench was terrible. It was just atrocious. He described other scenes where he'd be driving down a road. He'd look off to the side of the road, and there would be a human leg or a human head. And people would just be walking by. Nobody really cared. But there's a leg. Aren't you interested to know, like, whose leg is that and why is it there? And the point of his book, he said, I learned something about myself. He said, I always prided myself on being an African. But if that's what it means to be African, to have really no value for human life at all, he said, that's not me. I learned I'm an American. And these ways of life, these cultures are really, really different. As bad as America has become in many ways, I think it's still shocking for most Americans. If they were to drive down a road and see a head, see a human leg, it would be deeply disturbing. I think most people would want to stop. They'd call the police. There's something wrong here. We've got to figure out what this is. Whereas people driving down the road in Rwanda don't even stop to notice because they don't care. And the point here is different cultures are very different on a scale of morality.
Right.
Some cultures are better at teaching people, reassuring people. You know, the truth is, Dave, to be moral, to be good, it's work. It's hard.
It is.
Because it can
it's a little scary sometimes.
It can be scary. And so, you know, yes, it certainly is true that in the end, each of us as individuals, we are responsible for the choices we make. That's true. If I choose to murder, in the end, that's on me. Nobody else is going to get arrested. If I commit a murder, I'm the one rightfully going to get arrested. And at the same time, it's also true, we more collectively, as a culture, as a nation, we can do things to sort of reassure people, reinforce the idea of being moral is good, it's honorable, right? Versus encouraging people to be immoral, incentivizing people to be irresponsible or cruel or unjust. And so different cultures, there's a whole moral spectrum. And the same thing happens when you look at one culture over time.
Right.
A culture can change. And this is my great concern about the United States, is that our culture as a people, as an American people, it's changing dramatically and not in a good way. I mean, it is this profoundly disturbing coincidence that 50 years ago, a mere 50 years ago, slogans like diversity, non-judgmentalism, tolerance, these weren't even concepts 50 years ago. People weren't talking about those things. They weren't popularized slogans. And 50 years ago, there were very few random mass murders.
Right.
Today, those slogans are everywhere. Everywhere. Diversity is great. Don't judge people. Be welcoming. That really has become a kind of orthodoxy. In a sense, it's become the religion of the American culture today. At the same moment, when there's this spike in things like random mass murders, how is it that a nation of people that says, be open-minded to everyone, be open and accepting, how is it those people with increasing frequency go out and try to murder and slaughter as many human beings as they can?
You use those words and you say that they weren't part of the lexicon. I think it's even worse than that. I think we understood them differently before and where we understand them now. And these are things that you have brought to light quite often over the last few years as we've run the Vino Veritas Society. The idea of a leader, mm-hmm. right? There was a time in our country where being a leader was it was condescending. If I called you a leader, it was negative. You're a charlatan. You're not anything special. You're just trying to lead me down some path to take advantage of me.
Yeah.
And now we herald our leaders.
We hold conferences, really expensive conferences, right? On leadership
how to be a leader.
How to be a leader. Yeah.
Another word you brought up that hits home for me, and we've talked about this at length, is the word tolerance. Mm-hmm. We promote tolerance today. Like it's this great thing, this great concept that everybody should be tolerated. No, everybody should be respected for themselves and for what they bring to the table. They should be judged based on the content of their character, as Martin Luther King Jr. said.
Yep.
Tolerance, you go back to George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation in 1790. He's sitting there saying, you will no longer merely be tolerated.
Right.
I don't want to just be tolerated. I don't want you to say, I don't like Jews, but I'm going to tolerate you because you fit a certain box that I like.
Isn't it fascinating? If you walk into any typical university department of sociology or political science or history or anything like that, you would certainly encounter that word tolerance often in discussions, and it would always be held up as a good thing, as a kind of virtue. And yet, when I think of tolerance, I think of my kids when they were really little, and right, as a parent, what do you do when you have really little kids, 1 year old, 2 years old, right? And they have all this energy, and they don't know yet how to behave themselves. You tolerate their shenanigans up to a point.
Yep.
And then at some point you're done tolerating. Nope, you're going to your room, whatever it is. That's tolerating. As an adult citizen, I don't want a government that tolerates me as if they're my parents, waiting to send me to a timeout.
And so it's just interesting to see how those words, those things have changed, and that changes the regime. And this is sort of where these two issues of what I was talking about with the World Cup in Qatar and what we're seeing now in these mass shootings that are coming along in America. I kept saying earlier, what happens when the regime no longer is representative of what we rationally and reasonably know are natural rights?
Right.
And do we live in an America today where our American regime respects natural rights, and the progressives will say, no, we tolerate people, and we have leaders, and those leaders should make good decisions, but there's no such thing as natural rights.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I would come at it also in a way from the opposite direction, or the opposite side. It's sort of like looking at two sides of the same coin. There are certain civic virtues and qualities that we talk a lot about at the Vino Veritas Society. They're core.
Mm-hmm.
And first among them is the idea of self-restraint. I mean, it sounds so simple, right? But govern yourself, control yourself. I was reminded as I was thinking about this, Abraham Lincoln, when he was young, I believe he was a teenager at the time, there was a neighbor who went insane, and they had to haul the neighbor off. And he was, shouting, and he was violent. And I mean, I don't know what happened, but the man lost his mind, and it really haunted Lincoln. Lincoln wrote these really dark poems about what it means when a man loses his reason, right? When he can't think, he can't speak coherently, he can't really make conscious, rational choices, right? If you've lost your mind, if some disease has infected your brain and you can't think, he said, we basically become like animals. We become not very human, and that terrified him, because he thought that the ability of a human being to use our mind, to use our reason, and to govern ourselves individually, to actually make rational choices about what we're going to do and not do, regardless of how we feel. Sometimes we choose to override our feelings. We might feel scared and still choose to do something courageous. We might feel like not taking a medicine that tastes bad, but still choose to take it because we know it's good for us. That's the essence of being a human being. And he was right about that. It is core, and it's a central feature of a free society. A truly free society is a nation of people who have self-restraint. They exercise restraint. They govern themselves. That's how we can have a government of very limited constitutional powers, because most of the governing is done individually. We govern ourselves. So we don't need, police agents and regulators in every room, in every building, watching us 20, because we govern ourselves. And I think this is a question worth raising. Do modern Americans have the self-restraint to be a free, self-governing people?
Well, so you talk about that when you're talking about Lincoln, about this losing your mind, this rot in the brain that makes you go essentially insane and unable to reason.
Yeah.
I'm going to kind of put you on the spot a little bit, being the academic scholar you are of Lincoln.
Yeah.
And what would Lincoln's response be if he sat down today and said, okay, this isn't the rotting of the mind. These are people whose minds are fully capable of reasoning, but instead they're being told there's no such thing as natural rights. They're being told there's no right or wrong. They're being told nihilism is good.
I want to pose this, and I want to be. This is delicate stuff. I mean, we're talking about this in the wake of two horrific mass murders, and of course, these are only the two most recent. I mean, ever since Columbine, which was 1999. 1999 was Columbine.
Can I do a little side note on that?
Sure.
This was really interesting. I was on a plane back to Colorado on Tuesday night.
Mm-hmm.
Tuesday night we had just had the Club Q shooting in Colorado Springs, and Tuesday night was the night of the shooting in Walmart.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting next to a girl on the plane. She's also from Denver. She's a little younger than me, and we're talking, and she was supposed to go to Columbine. So I was a senior when Columbine happened. I was a senior in high school at a rival high school of Columbine.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I knew the school well. You and I have a mutual friend who was shot in the Columbine attack.
Yeah.
I knew several people involved, and met some people afterward who were friends with the shooters. And it's a really scary thing. And I'm talking to this girl who ended up going to Colorado Academy because her parents did not want her going to Columbine. She was, I think, in 8th grade when the Columbine shooting happened. And they said, you're not going to that school. We're going to put you in a private school. Now, the comment that she made to me right after, this is what really got my antennas up, the ears perked up. She said, ever since Columbine, being that close to it, she asked, does this happen for you too? That I'm kind of numb to all of these other shootings.
Mm.
And I get her point.
Yeah.
But that's where we're at.
Yeah.
You were just saying, ever since Columbine happened in 1999, we've had this string. I think that's where you were going.
Yeah. Well, the point I was going to make is they've been happening with increased frequency.
Right.
Since it's almost a quarter of a century ago was Columbine. And we see these things happening with increased frequency. And there are some important sociological insights and suggestions. Once something like this becomes kind of normalized, it becomes much easier for others to be copycats. So there's a psychology to these things. There are many other aspects to it. But the point I want to make, and I genuinely mean this, I do not mean to be insensitive to any of the people who are out there who have lost family members or suffering. I mean this in the deepest, profoundest moral and philosophic sense. As we watch these things happen, can our fellow Americans say with confidence that these mass murders are objectively wrong? And I say that, this isn't some kind of word game or a gotcha game. I say this because I hear our fellow citizens, many of them, insist on many occasions there is no objective right and wrong. There is no, sometimes they'll get defensive about it. They'll get aggressive about it. There is no right and wrong. They'll point a finger at you and insist you're a bigot. You're somehow narrow-minded if you think there's one right and wrong. Mm-hmm. There are just different views, different opinions. Very often our fellow citizens will use this rhetorical question as if it is definitive. They'll say, who's to say what's right and wrong? And And they'll never try to answer that question. Just throw the question out there, assuming, it can't be answered. Who's to say what's right and wrong? Everyone has their own views. Okay. So we've been preaching that and teaching that to citizens, to children, now for decades. And so I ask in all earnestness, do Americans think that mass random murders, and I'm not talking about incidents of self-defense, I'm talking about when some purposeless, nihilistic killer loads up a gun and goes and just starts shooting random people he doesn't know and simply for the purpose of murdering as many as he can. Is that objectively wrong? And for those who say, yeah, it is, the next question would be, why? How can we know that it's objectively wrong?
Well, and let's not just hold this to guns, right?
Right.
The murderer who goes and gets in a car and mows over people on a sidewalk. Yeah. The person who goes and stabs 30, 40 people. Yep. And sometimes they're not mass random murders all done at one time. But this weekend in Chicago, we had 40 people shot. I mean, is shooting another human being, whether you know them or not, is there ever cause to shoot another human being? And what makes that right or wrong? Why do we have a prison system? How do you, and you look at the trickle down from that. We now are getting situations where we're saying we need prison reform. We shouldn't have the cashless bail system. We shouldn't be holding people because how can you justify it? Yeah. That person's a victim of their circumstances. It's not actually wrong because they killed somebody. We need to understand the person. We need to understand what their motives were. We need to understand what they went through. And maybe that person shouldn't be held responsible.
You're pointing to another really important piece of this. And it's almost this terrible, an old phrase, perfect storm. It's like a terrible, perfect storm. We have this cultural rot. We have growing numbers of Americans who don't believe that there is such a thing as right and wrong. And look, this is just a hard human truth. It's hard for people to exercise self-restraint and do what is good or be good when they don't believe there's a good.
Right.
And now couple that with a government that is utterly failing in its purpose. Its purpose is to protect individual rights. Protect means at a really basic level, a government protecting rights means it goes and arrests murderers and rapists and thieves and arsons and vandals, right? Those citizens who go out and prey on fellow citizens and violate other people's rights, they should be arrested. They should be charged with crime. And in serious cases, they should be put in jail so that they can't violate any more rights. And we have a government now that is very selective. It says, well, there are certain groups of people that we feel that we really shouldn't arrest them, even though they're violating the rights of others. I mean, here in Denver, there was a high profile case where there were some patriots who wanted to stand up in public. They were in a public space and talk about their property rights and their freedom. And they were being harassed and intimidated by Antifa thugs. And the city officials, they gave instructions to the police department. And they said, don't arrest them. Don't arrest the Antifa guys.
Right.
If Antifa guys are going out pushing people, punching people, hitting people with clubs, violating rights, don't arrest them. We think that they're a special class. Now, you put these two things together, a culture of people who don't believe in right and wrong and therefore are really going to struggle to find reasons to exercise self-restraint, and couple that with a government that is failing miserably to protect rights, you have a dangerous, dangerous situation.
Well, and it gets worse than that because those same people who are advocating for that scenario are the same ones saying, but Elon Musk, who bought Twitter and is going to give has offered Donald Trump a platform to speak again.
Right.
Elon Musk should go to jail.
Right.
The person who killed somebody, the person who's harassing, who's threatening, who's violating somebody's property rights, that person, we need to understand their circumstance. But Elon Musk is giving a platform to Donald Trump. He should be in prison.
He should be. You're absolutely right. Let's use the view today, growing view, increasing views. Let's use government to promote our political agenda.
Right.
At the highest levels, the very highest levels, let's use congressional committees and the Justice Department to to investigate political opponents and make sure that they can't run for office and these sorts of things. Let's use government to silence someone like Elon Musk. And at the same time, not only are these random mass murders, and I always like to emphasize that random part because it is a certain strange character of crime. There have always been crimes of passion. I mean, ever since there have been human beings who are jealous or angry at someone else, and so they go seek revenge, and sometimes it's murder or assault. That's been happening for as long as human beings have been around. What's strange today are these people who go out and just find random strangers. Mm-hmm. There's no revenge there. There's no personal, right? There was no personal wronging or injustice. They just want to go slaughter on wide scales. Not only are the random mass murders becoming more frequent, also becoming more frequent are related stories where many of these people who engaged in the murders, they're being reported months, years before for various things, right? We keep hearing from government officials, well, if only we had information, if there's some kind of war. It turns out a lot of these murders, they should be on the guy down in Florida. Multiple people were calling the FBI for months saying, man, this guy is posting all kinds of violent threats on social media. He's talking about how he wants to kill people and murder. Like, you should really check, right? They don't do anything. This guy in Colorado Springs, I mean, this is crazy. He was threatening to he built a bomb and was threatening to blow up his mother's house, and his mother had to call the police, right? Nothing ever happened of this. Right. There was no criminal charges. This guy nothing happened. And so the point is, we have a government that's simply failing to do its job. It's not even enforcing. I mean, you're supposed to have, for a government to be legitimate, it should be a government that passes laws, the purpose of protecting rights. And then you got to enforce those laws. Actually enforce good laws.
Yeah.
We're not enforcing good laws. We use all this discretion. At the same time of this cultural rot, I wanted to mention this. I have in front of me one of my favorite little pieces of literature, which is C.S. Lewis's essay, The Abolition of Man. And there's a lot to say on this. I would sometime love, maybe we do a little, I don't know, some kind of special program where we work our way through it. It's a very short read. Mm-hmm. He ends the first section here with these few lines. He says, "We now make men without chess and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and then bid the geldings to be fruitful." His point is, right, we teach people, we promote nihilism, we laugh at honor, we mock the idea of truth. This is so ridiculous. That's so old-fashioned. That's so non-progressive to talk about right and wrong. We've advanced beyond that. And then we seem shocked that growing numbers of people want to go out and engage in mass murder. And at the same time, growing numbers of people are depressed, and growing numbers of people seem to live without any purpose in their life. And growing numbers of people they're addicted to drugs and alcohol or terrible combinations of them. We're shocked that growing numbers of people are taking their own lives. They're committing suicide as we spew this nihilism. There's, when you really drill into this, I made the case before, and I'll stand by this. In the end, choice matters, and individual choice does have responsibility. And it's also true that we should not expect, I want to be really clear about this, we should not expect individuals to make good choices when they are taught from the earliest years. They are taught that there's no right and wrong. They're not taught how to make good choices. And I don't mean to absolve individuals from all responsibility. I'm just saying this is a human reality. This goes back to the spectrum of cultures. When you have cultures that promote and incentivize cruelty and injustice, you know what you should expect? A lot of cruelty and injustice. Not everybody, but expect a lot of it.
Yeah. There's a step further on this that has really bothered me, and that is the inconsistency. When you talk about the cruelty and the injustice, something we talk all the time about is the equal application of the law. And you were talking about, teaching right and wrong applies to human beings equally. I don't care what your background is. I don't care what your faith is, where you're born. If we believe in natural rights, we believe in the equal application of those natural rights and the equal application of the law. We have created this subjective reality where I remember growing up, being in school and the teacher posing the moral question of, if you're hungry, is stealing a loaf of bread okay?
Right.
And creating this subjective conversation.
Right.
Well, no, theft is theft. If you're hungry and you want to go ask somebody, I'm hungry, will you please give me a loaf of bread? That's totally different than, I'm hungry, I have to survive, and my need to survive is more important than your property in that piece of bread. And we've gotten to this point of, it's subjective. If somebody has less money, if somebody comes from a background or is a form of diversity that is expected to have less opportunity, we start to excuse behaviors. And this goes back to, let's bring back the two topics of conversation from today. You have Qatar, you have all of that stuff that went on.
Yep. And
then you have these horrible, angry, violent, random mass shootings.
Yeah.
Let's take this Qatar situation. Let's move it to America. Let's say this was actually happening in America, and you kind of can through the sex slave trade, as we talked about. But let's really make it about a stadium, and let's say that the United States was awarded a stadium, and they went to a bunch of Central American and South American countries where people are really poor, Venezuela, where the government has just, raped people of their property.
So come to America, really good paying jobs, build a stadium.
Right. And you in reality turn them into indentured servants.
Yes.
If it's Elon Musk who does that, Elon Musk must go to jail.
Right.
Elon Musk should be hung in the streets, is what
that would
everybody
that would be
say.
The narrative in the media, and that would be the dominant response. Right.
Now, what if it was Al Sharpton?
Right.
What if it was Louis Farrakhan? What if Louis Farrakhan went out and said, "Hey, I've got all these people. I'm black. I can relate to them." Yeah. And they know I'm being honest with them. They know, no, you're not. But he goes and puts them all in indentured servitude. Are we going to treat the two of them differently? To me, both of them are committing a horrific crime and should be punished equally. And this nihilist view in America, this nihilist reality in America, this is where we have the American regime has lost its way.
Yeah.
That's where we are now saying you need to treat perpetrators of crime differently based on their skin color, their religion, their background, their where they grew up, etc.
And really what that is, when you really boil it down, it's a form of tribalism. And there's a couple more pieces here to flesh out this perfect storm that we're experiencing right now. I think it's no coincidence that what's going on in the United States comes after waves of modern social engineering experiments with different programs. I'm thinking of Charles Murray's famous little study he published in 1984. This is back in 1984. Think of how long ago that was. He wrote a book titled Losing Ground. And what he did is he did something that no progressives like to do today. He actually measured the results of social programs from 1950 through 1980. And the way the United States government incentivized things like fatherlessness, breaking up of family, women purposely having children out of wedlock. And so you have generations of kids growing up not knowing their fathers. All that's a background. All that is a background to what we see going on today. And then you couple to it this intense tribalism that reduces everything to a friend versus enemy, those two categories. That's it. And there's political tribalism, which is really prevalent. There's religious tribalism, racial tribalism. The result is that it has made it near impossible for many Americans to have any kind of meaningful, thoughtful, nuanced conversations. We tend to reduce everything to you're either in my box and you're good, or you're not in my, but you're in the other box, and therefore I hate you. Today, after after the shootings and murders in Colorado Springs. It was at a club that was popular, frequented by homosexuals and others. It really could be reduced to this. Right now, there are many Americans thinking about that subject of those murders, and they think you either fly the rainbow flag and therefore show that you're with us, or you have blood on your hands. You're the equivalent of a murder, or you're excusing murder, right? No substance at all. It's impossible to say, well, I'm not sure I want to fly the flag because I don't agree with everything that flag says. But that doesn't mean I absolutely condemn murder. I'm not just right. We can't even have those conversations. And I think it's affecting in a big way how people act and how they live.
It absolutely is. And it's affecting it more than anything, because I think human beings, and I think we see this in all of the old philosophical texts, in the classical writings, we are naturally communal beings. Mm-hmm. Right. We need that interaction with other people. Yep. It's the morality of capitalism, this idea of being able to trade with other people, and I can provide value to you and you can provide value to me, and we can each determine what that value is, and for ourselves, we are these naturally communal beings. And these tribal boxes keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. I might agree with this group about something, and it puts me in a big box, and I get inside that box, and then I realize there's 10 more boxes in there. Mm-hmm. because now once I'm in that box, I've got to find, okay, what box am I inside of that box? And then I get into that box, and there's 20 more boxes inside of that, and all of a sudden I'm in this little tiny box with 2 other people.
Every little cultural tribe has subcultures to it, right? It consists of many subcultures.
And each of those subcultures has a subculture that has a subculture that has a subculture.
Yeah.
And we've gotten to a point where I feel like we're in this world of circle the wagons around just the people that you can, you agree with on everything. Yeah. Because if you don't agree with somebody on everything, they're going to attack you. I could agree with somebody on 99.9% of the issues out there. Mm-hmm. We could be on the same wavelength. We could believe in all the same things and everything else, but we might observe our faith differently. Mm-hmm. Or we might believe in who knows what. I might like blue curtains and you like black curtains, and all of a sudden we're bad. Like, you're my enemy now, right? We agree on everything, and something that small and you can't function in a society where you have to be in such a small box with such a small group of people, right? Because then everyone else out there is your enemy. And that's the point where when you're nihilistic and you say, well, there's no right or wrong, and 99.9% of the society is my enemy, and I can't relate to them, and I can't spend time with them, and I can't have interactions with them because they're going to judge me. And they're going to attack me for that little 0.1% of things we disagree on. You can't participate in it.
Well, and I think there's a connection there. This was one of the great central lessons offered by Leo Strauss, the professor of political philosophy. He would emphasize that in the sort of the starting ground, the premise for classical thought was a general agreement that there is truth. Now, there's disagreement on what the truth is. People had Plato and Aristotle disagreed with each other. Lots of intelligent thinking minds disagree. They agree that there's truth, and that serves as the premise for a conversation. Well, if we both agree there's truth, but we disagree on what the content of truth is, let's test our ideas and our arguments. You make the case for what you think is true, and I'll listen and think about it. And if I see flaws in your reasoning or evidence you've ignored, I'll point that out, and then you do the same for me. And through those discussions, it's what the old thinkers used to call dialectic. Through that dialectic back and forth, we actually help each other get closer to the truth. Mm-hmm. We refine our opinions, our thinking. When you start with the premise, there is no truth. That's our agreed premise. There is no truth. Well, then there is no dialectic. There is no making progress.
Mhm.
They need to be destroyed because they're the obstacle to me getting what I want. And that's the kind of tribalism that I see in our modern sort of nihilistic culture.
It goes back to one of the lines that is one of my bigger pet peeves is let's agree to disagree.
Right.
Right. If I'm saying there's a truth, let's explore what the truth is. There's no truth.
Right.
I think there is. Let's talk about it. No, let's agree to disagree. I'm gonna just say there's no truth. You're gonna say there's. How can we coexist in a world where you say there's no truth,
right,
and I say there is, and therefore we can't agree on the basic building blocks of society and
let's make it really primordial here. If you say I think it's wrong to eat people, and I say I don't think it's wrong to eat people, I'm quite willing to eat you. We can't be friends and neighbors and fellows, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've got you in particular have a problem if you're living next door to someone who views you as food, who's going to kill you and eat you. Those two people can't agree to disagree. There has to be some common ground, some common moral ground for us to be able to agree to disagree.
And there's very little of that anywhere in the world left today. And that was what made America special.
Here's the point, and this sort of brings us to the bow to wrap up this podcast. The beautiful thing about the United States is it was a regime, it was a nation founded on that common ground.
Mm-hmm.
That common ground was this idea that applies to all human beings. It was common. It should be common, not merely to all Americans. It should be common to all human beings. We all have these unalienable individual natural rights. And if we can respect that, then we can agree to disagree on other things. We can disagree on what the best movie is or the best book is or what our favorite flavors of ice cream. We can have those disagreements because we agree on the foundational thing. We all have the same rights. We're not going to hurt each other.
And today we can't even get into what's the best flavor of ice cream or what's the best book or what's the best movie because everything is politicized. And this is something this has been an ongoing theme. Now everything is about, is there truth or not?
Yep.
Everything being politicized has made it impossible to have a reasonable conversation of, is it soccer or football?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, going back to that commercial I was talking about earlier, is it soccer or is it football?
So here's the good news. This has been one of our darker podcasts, and it's possible some listeners might think this is a pessimistic theme, but there's hope. There's light at the end of the tunnel, and that is there are those ideas, those principles of the American founding. They're still there. Those self-evident truths are still true. And all we have to do is turn back to them and embrace them in our hearts, in our minds, in our laws, in our ways of living. And we would be a much happier and a much better people if we did.
Absolutely. With that, we'll continue to guard the American idea. We'll continue to guard those truths. Sumus Custodes.
Yep.